Land is the basis of all independence.
All right, we're back. This is Dr. V's Revolution Will Not Be Pesticides. And this particular video, we're going to talk a little bit about Memorial Day. Memorial Day in remembering the veterans who supposedly fought valiantly for American freedom and democracy. No. Memorial Day in terms of remembering those African Americans, those black people in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who purchased land throughout the late 19th century, early 20th century, despite the fact that they weren't granted restitution or reparations for slavery or any of those things, despite the fact that they were cheated out of the land that they were supposed to get in many parts of the South, despite the fact that they hustled and bustled, pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, came together, bought their own farms, bought their own land, bought their own grocery stores, purchased their own schools, educated themselves, and thrived in a booming community known as the Greenwood community in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Despite all that, angry mobsters who were in cahoots of the government, who doesn't seem to get much of the blame for this, decided to destroy this community on Memorial Day weekend, 1921, exactly 100 years ago to this day. So when I remember Memorial Day, or when I think of Memorial Day, something in me I cannot get myself to think about soldiers who are fighting in these wars abroad. Because to me, a lot of these soldiers that are fighting in these wars abroad are nothing but peons. They're nothing but pawns who have been sent out abroad not for freedom and democracy, though they might think that's what they're fighting for. A lot of them, in my opinion, have been fighting for greed, corporations, right? That doesn't even necessarily benefit the people who are actually fighting. And then when they come back home from fighting, they're disrespected by that same government. They're not given the benefits that they're promised. They're neglected. They have all kinds of mental issues. So Memorial Day and Veterans Day and all these kinds of things, to me, it's nothing but hypocrisy. So when I think of Memorial Day, I remember not those soldiers necessarily who go abroad and, at the end of the day, a lot of us, we're all being used. But sometimes you have to try to take personal responsibility and stand up against those who are using you. But when I remember Memorial Day, when I think of Memorial Day, I think of those who fought in a different war. I think of those black people, those African Americans, who went out into Oklahoma and purchased their own land, and who had to fight for that land. I think about the 300 people that died in the process. That's who I remember. So how does the story go? Well, 100 years ago, there was a man by the name of Dick Rowland who was riding in an elevator with a white woman on Memorial Day weekend. Apparently, what ended up happening was this man ended up touching this white woman Some people say there's a lot of different stories when it comes to this historical account. Some people say that these two probably had a prior relationship, and the white woman, was upset with the black man. Some people say that these people didn't know each other, and then the black man simply just tripped, and then ended up grabbing the white woman's hand on accident while he was falling, and she screamed. But nevertheless, the point is this: there was a thriving black community called the Greenwood community on one side of the tracks, and just north of those tracks was a white community. And somewhere in the middle there was a building in which these two individuals had met in an elevator. The woman runs out of the elevator screaming. The black man gets arrested. And while he's in the courthouse, detained, a white mob goes to the courthouse to pull him out. Not because they wanted to see him not get arrested, and not because they wanted to see him not face any kind of penalty, but it's because they wanted street justice. So the black community comes to the courthouse as well to make sure that this doesn't happen. So what ends up happening is a gunfight breaks out between the blacks and the whites. Both groups armed, both groups ready to go to war for what they consider to be their own people. The fight breaks out, and the white population ends up prevailing. The blacks retreat back to their community, and they are followed. Now, the thing is this: building up to this point, there had been a lot of incidents where you're starting to see heightened discrimination, heightened segregation, heightened all kinds of things. People getting sued for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and all kinds of things. But this case of the Tulsa, Oklahoma Massacre of 1921 is when this kind of reached its pinnacle. So they follow them all back to the Greenwood community, and then they destroy the Greenwood community. Okay? 100 years ago to this day. Now this lasted 2 days, May 31st, June 1st. In the process, they say the estimates vary. I've heard as little as only 30 people died, and I've heard as much as more than 300 people died. More than 1,400 houses and businesses were destroyed in the process. 35 square blocks were destroyed. 14,000 people around there were left homeless. And this tragedy of 1921 had pretty much gone undiscussed in the mainstream, in public settings, in history books, until as recent as about the 1990s. There were reports at the time that this had to have been something greater than just a mob of people destroying this community. Some people said that there were incendiary bombs going off, military-type explosives, planes flying from above, dropping bombs. And a lot of the rioters that were involved in this, the white rioters, were veterans, World War I veterans. So when we talk about Memorial Day, you can talk about those who fought in official wars for the United States government, for corporations. Or you can talk about those who fought in real, organic wars. Wars for liberty, wars for true freedom, wars to defend your land and your family. Because the veterans that we celebrate and those who had passed in Memorial Day and Veterans Day, to me, those people were not fighting for those basic, essential things of life. They're not fighting for liberty. They're not fighting for freedom. They're not fighting to protect and defend the land that they live on. And it's as General Smedley Butler once said in his writings, war is a racket. We're fighting for corporations. These people have been fighting for all kinds of things. So when I think of Memorial Day, I'm thinking of these people who fought and died to defend their land and their territory in the Greenwood community of Tulsa, Oklahoma. If you go back and read the works of Ida B. Wells, she wrote about this in 1892. She had Red Record. She had another one called Southern Horrors, Lynch Laws, and All Its Phases. And in her writings, she came to the conclusion that anytime white groups wanted to justify the brutality of blacks, they always accused the blacks of violating white women. In all her studies, everything that she came up with, Ida B. Wells realized all these lynchings that were going on throughout the South, throughout the North, throughout the country in the late 19th century, they all had one of three things in common. Those that were accused of violating or raping white women, which was the justification for the lynching, they were either very politically active, they were competitive in terms of business, or they dated outside of their race. They dated white women. They all exhibited these similar characteristics. She came to the conclusion that the whole violation of white women was just an excuse to get more people on board in order to put an end to this, to put an end to progress, black progress. So the thing is this. If this is the case, if the simple liberty that the blacks were striving for throughout the United States at this time is a reason, a justification for their slaughter, for their removal from the land, for the destruction of property, you cannot tell me that people, not only black people, but just people in general, are not in a state of war. When your government justifies the stripping of land, the taking of property, and the taking of freedom at the drop of the dime just because one is able to gain too much wealth or one is able to gain too much prosperity, you're in a state of war. And just as Bob Marley once said,
until the philosophy which owed one race superior and another inferior is finally and permanently discredited and abandoned. Well, everywhere is war. This your war.
Until the philosophy which holds one race superior and the other one inferior, there's a war. Let's talk about the founding of this Greenwood community. I even have some theories about this. All right. So we know that the Greenwood community was established by a guy by the name of O.W. Gurley. He decided, I think it was from Arkansas, he decided to move out to Oklahoma and purchase 40 acres of land. When he purchased his 40 acres of land, he started selling land to other blacks and encouraging other blacks to move around there. Now, even before that, all the way after the Civil War, out of 32 black cities that were established, or black townships that were established throughout the country, 28 of them were actually in Oklahoma. Oklahoma was known for being like the place in which black people felt that they can go and receive some kind of prosperity. Now, my theory about this is that if you go all the way back, even before the Civil War, and you go all the way back to the 1830s, where you had the Indian Removal Act, a lot of the Native Americans were moving out to Oklahoma as well. Remember, Oklahoma was one of the last states to become a state in the United States. It didn't become a state until the year 1907. That's when Oklahoma got its statehood. So it was marked as Indian territory. But not only was it marked as Indian territory, But you got to remember, when you go all the way back, like the blacks that lived in Oklahoma had a tradition of independence, liberty, and freedom. So if you go all the way back to early founding of this country, even before the founding of this country, when South Carolina was nothing but a British colony, the South Carolinian planters were importing African people from mostly the Upper Guinea region of West Africa, Senegambia, Sierra Leone region, and also importing a lot of Africans from the Congo. These Africans came into South Carolinian region, some of them in the Sea Island, some of them on the mainland. And we would later refer to these people as the Gullah Geechee or Geechee people, right? Now, these Africans in South Carolina, for whatever reason, maybe because of their spirit of liberty that they had from their African cosmology and philosophy in the lands that they came from, or basically maybe because of just the sheer harsh treatment that they had to endure through time, they ran away. These Africans decided to run. They fought and they ran. There's a notable slave revolt in South Carolina known as the Stoner Rebellion in 1739, September of 1739. But even leading up to that point, African Americans were fleeing South Carolina. You know where they were running to? They were running to Florida. Florida at the time was a Spanish society. It was a Spanish territory, which really didn't practice slavery to the degree that some of the other colonial Spanish societies had. Black people that were running to, or African people that were running into Florida throughout the late 1600s into the 1700s and even into the 18 and 1900s, they had one of three options. Some of them that ran into Florida created their own independent communities known as Maroon communities, also known as Cimarron communities, because that was the name that the Spanish used to refer to runaway slave communities as Cimarron or Cimarrones. They either did that. Some of them ran away and mixed in with the Native Americans. They would be referred to as the Black Seminoles. And then you had some that ran away and then pretty much jumped on board with the Spanish and helped defend and protect Spanish territory in a community known as Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose. Now, for short, this is known as Fort Mose. But Florida was a safe haven for runaways, and they fought tooth and nail to defend their freedom in that territory. And it was generational freedom. Florida freedom was not just, I'm running away, I'm hiding in a bush. No, it was, I'm running away, and I'm going to defend and protect this territory at all costs. Even when the Spanish eventually abandoned Florida by 1821, the Africans who had lived in Florida continued to protect and defend the land. So our government, the U.S. military at the time, the ones that were supposed to celebrate, decided to go hunt down these runaways. Because when cotton started to expand farther and farther into the deep south and then farther and farther westward, they were looking for new territories, fertile ground to continue to plant cotton, and then also engage in the sugar trade as well. So Florida eventually was annexed as a part of the United States when the Spanish gave it up in 1821 under the Adams-Onis Treaty. But there was an issue there for a lot of the planters that were trying to establish themselves cotton and sugar plantations. And the issue was what? Military-prone Africans and Native Americans fighting to defend and protect their freedom. And the U.S. military was fighting to take that freedom away. But they had gone down into Florida for decades to try to take over the land. But the runaways, or the Black Seminoles, the Maroons, continued to fight. And when they continued to fight, the U.S. government realized we have to find a way to divide and conquer these people. So they eventually decided to sign a treaty. In 1838, the U.S. military signed a treaty with the Black Seminoles, offering them the ability to go westward in what would be considered later as Oklahoma. So hundreds of blacks eventually signed this treaty. Despite the fact that you had thousands of blacks rebel, thousands of blacks escaped Florida. Some of them went to Andros Island off the coast of the Bahamas, or in the Bahamas. Some of them escaped to Cuba. Some of them mixed in and went farther south with the Native Americans. But you had hundreds, if I'm not mistaken, about 500 blacks that under this treaty had gone into Oklahoma in 1838. Now from there, people were trying to enslave the African Americans in Oklahoma, and a lot of them end up escaping to Mexico. And to this day, you can find the descendants of the runaway slaves, the black Seminoles from Florida, who originally came from South Carolina, in Mexico. But what about the ones that didn't escape? Are they the foundation of this thriving Greenwood community? Because in 1830, if you go look at, reading an article here, it states here that Tulsa race riot of 1821 made national headlines on June 1st of this year, its 90th anniversary. Tulsa quietly, blah, 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 blah. Let's see. Scroll down. It says here, in this environment, a conspiracy of silence was born. All right, so in the 1830s, many African Americans journeyed to what would later be called Oklahoma, experiencing undesirable hardships along the Trail of Tears with the 5 civilized tribes. Under Andrew Jackson's administration, the Indian Removal Act relocated the tribes and their slaves to the established Twin Territories. All right, now, this article refers to them as their slaves, but these were free African American people, known as black Seminoles, many of whom had gone out there. Now, so these towns had been, so after the Civil War was over, as it says here, of the 32 black townships that were established in America after the Civil War, 28 of them were in Oklahoma before it became a state. Now, why were so many blacks attracted to Oklahoma? Maybe it had something to do with the black Seminoles being there, being these courageous fighters who had fought for their liberty and freedom. But what would later happen is there would be an oil boom in Oklahoma, which attracted a lot more African Americans, many of whom were starting to come from Mississippi, and had moved out to Oklahoma, and they started to purchase more land and utilize the profits made from oil to establish businesses, schools, grocery stores, farms, and ensure that they had a thriving community out there. They took heed to the philosophy of Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington believed that the black man in America probably should not try to get too close to the white man. White men were scared, right? Right after the Civil War, too many black people were trying to make too much progress too fast, and they were all up on white people. Booker T. Washington said we need to play it more slick. We need to play it more smooth. We need to be a little bit more cunning. Right? Metaphorically speaking, if the white man if he's a snake that's very, erratic and unpredictable, and you don't know when he's gonna bite, when he's gonna snap, when he's gonna hiss, play it cool. Don't get too close to him. Don't get in his face. Don't make demands. Don't beg. Don't even reason with him. Appeal to his emotions. Booker T. Washington, in his 1895 address, known as the Atlanta Compromise, he tickled the white man's ear. He said, we're not even going to demand integration. We're not going to demand political rights. We're not going to demand voting rights. All we want is equal protection under the law and a basic education. Those same racist whites that were hating the W.B. Du Bois types for being too vocal, too political, started to give Booker T. Washington money. He tickled the white man's ear. He made him feel good. And those same whites started to give Booker T. Washington money. Booker T. Washington took this money, invested it in his community, invested it in his school, Tuskegee Institute, down in Alabama. But you know what he also did? He took this same money and he secretly funded behind the scenes the operations of W.B. Du Bois and others who were fighting for the political rights. He secretly funded those things. He secretly funded the media. He secretly funded things that are silently powerful. This is the mentality of those of the Black Wall Street. And despite the fact that after the Civil War came, blacks didn't get any land, and while at the same time there was a Homestead Act that was passed that gave white peasants from Europe and other white citizens from the East free and cheap land out in the Great Plains region, 160 acres of land. Despite that,
at the very same time that America refused to give the Negro any land, through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm. Not only that, they provided county agents to further their expertise in farming. Not only that, they provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farms. Not only that, today many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. Now, this is what we are faced with, and this is the reality. Now, when we come to Washington in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
These blacks still pulled their resources together and pulled themselves up by the bootstraps and did it the right way. They were a part of this movement of land ownership because they knew more than anybody else that land was the basis of all independence and land was the basis of freedom, justice, and equality. And they had something to show for it. They were a thriving community. They were an affluent community. They had been so successful by taking heed to the principles of Booker T. Washington and self-sufficiency that the whites in the other communities started to crack down. Not by just doing better, but by violently attacking the Greenwood community. So, here we are, 100 years later, to the date, and there's actually a survivor who's still alive, or a couple of them. One of them remembers the whole incident. She's 107 years old. She goes by the name of, I think, Mama Fletcher. So, what do you do? Some people say, well, black people did everything the right way. They bought their land, they pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, they embraced capitalist ideology. And still, the government destroys it. Well, I say, you don't put too much faith in the government. If the government comes and destroys it, maybe you didn't plan hard enough. And I hate to sound so callous, but you can't sit there and bicker and whine. And when you're in a state of war, you cannot point fingers to your enemy and expect them to do you any favors. You have to go harder. That's all you could do. What do you do? Every grievance, every petition, every demand of restitution, reparation, that's like being in the middle of the state of war and stopping and saying, wait a second, can you give me some bullets to your enemy? If you're begging for restitution or reparations at this point, you must not think we're still in a state of war. But I believe that we are. Anyway, today I remember the Greenwood community of Tulsa, Oklahoma, the prosperous Black Wall Street, also known as Negro Wall Street, where African Americans came together, pooled their resources together, and prospered by purchasing land, farms, growing their own food, building their own businesses, taking advantage of the oil boom, selflessly coming together to protect themselves, their family, and their resources as a unit. One thing they probably should have invested in is bigger guns.